how impactful or significant do you think ESG ecosystem being today?
I think it is definitely extremely impactful, and it is driving or changing behaviors in the corporate world quite significantly. And I think in just the past 2 or 3 years, adding to the kind of impact that you see these investors having, I think there is also a great deal of realization that is now dawning within the corporates about the impact of many of these ESG issues and the need to therefore course correct. For instance, what we've experienced with COVID over the last 3 years, a kind of black swan event, which nobody anticipated, and which required you to be, in a sense, prepared. Very few companies were actually prepared with financial reserves or with modalities to actually deal with this kind of crisis, to manage their workforce, to deal with their stakeholders, to communicate transparently. Likewise, we're beginning to see with climate change as well, extreme climatic events are increasing in frequency and putting in peril the operations of many businesses around the world. We're doing this talk, in fact, alongside COP27 in Egypt, where huge focus on loss and damage. So I think there is now much greater realization within the corporate world as well of the need to change and to change really fast. We don't have that much time ahead of us if you have to tackle problems like climate change effectively. So I think all this is contributing to the broader debate on ESG, and it is pulling in a very wide range of stakeholders beyond just the investors themselves. I think customers are much more informed today, shareholders are much more informed, lenders are worried about the kind of risks that they may be taking on. So I think the push for effective change, therefore, as a result of all of this, is quite dramatic. And I think the corporates that have understood this are ahead of the game and de-risking their operations, but many others now beginning to realize that they need to also get with the ESG program really quickly.
I think that's probably the most comprehensive overview I've seen in a while about all the aspects, right? Speaking of debate, one word which is used very often these days with ESG is the term called greenwashing. Now, for some of our viewers, greenwashing is the practice where a lot of corporates, in spite of having less than adequate measures of doing, towards sustainability, still use print media and advertising to kind of mask it all and present a rosy picture of being the champion of ESG when in reality they're not. And slowly and steadily, with more scandals and more such disclosures coming out, it's becoming a real concern. So we've always, sitting at the outside, especially in an academia world, not really at the forefront, we've always wondered how much of this is real, how much of this is, media exaggeration. It would be lovely to have your perspective on, maybe from an India or a global perspective, on greenwashing and how concerning is it?
Well, internationally, I think you have heard about a series of scandals. There have been a number of investigations, raids that are taking place every other week on some of the best known financial institutions around the world. So clearly it is an issue of great concern. Quite recently, I think the Securities Exchange Commission in the United States, the Financial Conduct Authority in the United Kingdom, they've all come out now with statements around greenwashing and how this can actually be averted, the kind of expectations they have from fund managers, from corporates, and the kinds of disclosures they make, and what can and cannot be described as being, in a sense, ESG friendly. I think in India as well, SEBI is now undertaking a fair amount of work in terms of looking at, for instance, the fund system, the mutual fund system, and figuring out what funds are entitled to describe themselves as ESG funds, and what kind of metrics need to be actually looked at quite closely in order for people to demonstrate that they are either making improvement in ESG or not. So I think regulators around the world are now clearly paying much more attention to this, and it is an issue of great concern because investors, retailers, all kinds of people could be misled if they don't have the right data in front of them. In India, I think in some ways this is still very early days. The business responsibility and sustainability reporting template, which SEBI has prescribed for the top 1,000 listed companies, really kicks in from this financial year. So for the first time from next year, you will actually be able to cite data that suggests whether companies are on the right track or not. And there will be all kinds of stakeholders, equity analysts, non-profits, think tanks who will look at this data very closely and opine on whether you're seeing greenwashing in the Indian market or are people sort of really walking the talk. So I think in India, it's still early stages, but we've seen an equivalent of this, I would say, in years past, both in the business responsibility reporting in the past, which wasn't as prescriptive as the BRSR is now likely to be. And you saw a lot of corporates getting away in their sustainability reports with fairly exaggerated claims. But there were no penal consequences, and because there were very few scoring mechanisms around what was disclosed in the BRR, it didn't really make too much difference to them. Likewise on CSR, which is in some ways a subset of perhaps the S dimension in ESG, many Indian corporates have come out with glossy publications talking about the great work they're doing for communities and CSR. So I think there is typically an element of exaggeration in many of those claims, which would tantamount to greenwashing in the current environment. But I think the real sort of time and space to start looking at this very closely is from the disclosures that start happening from the next fiscal based on this fiscal's performance. And I think at that point, you're beginning to see, I think, much more accurate disclosure and also very clear testaments as to whether the company is on the right track or not.
Yeah, so I think let's hope that Indian corporates hopefully learn from the mistakes being done in the West. Speaking of mistakes, and there's always a political angle, you touched upon 2-3 points about the social aspect. Just before getting into the social aspect, we've started reading reports about US Democrats or US Republicans and politicians, in fact, making statements that probably ESG is not good for economic growth. It can derail economic growth. Maybe it's all coming out of these backlashes. So in many of the circles, we've been debating that is ESG eventually going to turn out like a fad where people 5-10 years later just focus only on the climate aspect about it, and ESG just fades away into the background with the political backlash that is potentially seem to be coming away. Just wanted your perspective. Do you really see that potentially at risk of happening?
So you're quite right. I think quite recently there have been a couple of major controversies. One was when Tesla was dropped from the S&P ranking of very ESG friendly entities, but they did that for reasons which they then explained had much more to do with some of the concerns around issues such as governance and treatment of labor, rather than necessarily the environmental issue, where everyone concedes that Tesla has been a pioneer in the electric vehicle ecosystem. Likewise, the point you made about maybe just picking one parameter, I think The Economist had a front page article around why you couldn't just focus on the climate issue to the exclusion of the very wide range of other E, S, and G issues, just to make life simpler for multiple constituencies in terms of what they're focusing on and the kind of improvements they're expecting from companies. But I think at the heart of this is basically concerns around how you interpret data. And because many ratings agencies claim to be looking at a very wide range of parameters, it creates confusion in the minds of users of some of the scores that come from those ratings agencies. And people, when they're confused and they're not certain what they need to rely on. A point I've often made is, look, there can be hundreds of parameters, but quite clearly for each company and each industry or sector it's part of, there'll be a relatively small subset of that wide universe of parameters that are what you would call material issues. Those are the ones that typically move the needle on performance. And so instead of worrying about what hundreds of parameters are disclosing about performance, try and pick out the handful of parameters that actually make a relevant difference. And those are the ones that if I were company management, if I were an investor, if I were a customer, if I were a lender, I would really look at quite closely. So when you raise the point about climate, for instance, not every industry is equally impacted by the climate issue or is a contributor to the climate problem or could potentially face regulatory action that could impact its future. But sure, if I'm in the steel industry, for instance, and I'm quite reliant, for instance, on very high temperatures in my processes. I need to burn coal in my blast furnace to achieve those temperatures. I am contributing significantly to the problem, and I should expect at some point regulatory action is going to impede my ability to operate. But if I'm a web design IT services firm, I've got a bunch of people sitting at home, they're not even traveling. Climate change or the climate impact is perhaps a very modest issue in the range of ESG issues that I would worry about. So I think people need to understand that there's a very large pool of data you can dip into. But what is relevant for your purposes, either as a manager or an investor, an external stakeholder, whatever, is a much smaller subset, and you need to pick and choose what you think is important for the purposes of the actions you want to take. And that, I think, we'll begin to see some evolution as we move forward, as we get more experience with managing all this data. So in India, the point I made earlier, you don't have the data to start with, at least not on scale. But from this year, for 1,000 listed companies, at least, we'll start getting reported next year. And then you'll start people coming out with use cases that lean on that data and use it for very interesting purposes. So for instance, you could have a fund manager who says, I'm going to back companies that are high on gender equity, because I think that's a very relevant consideration for India and has correlations with success that I've seen in other markets. And therefore, I'll back companies that are doing better on gender. Somebody else may say, I'm going to back companies that are low on carbon emissions. So they'll pick a small set of issues and then use that to actually support the kinds of companies and businesses that respond well to those data points. So I would say don't get unnerved by the range of possibilities. And don't use that as an excuse to say this doesn't make sense, because we are living in a world where data is
one size doesn't fit all.
Correct. And data is the new oil. If you have more data, actually, it's great because you can find use cases that become quite specific to the availability of that data. So rather than saying data is not important because there's too much of it, you need to see what use you can make of that huge volume of data that will now become available.
What I take away is the whole world is running around a unified framework for ESG, but we need to probably recognize that we may not exactly be able to achieve a unified framework which will apply across industries. And we'll have to be mature enough to adopt a set of frameworks and evolve into that set.
Just make one comment on that. I think people are looking for a common framework, at least in terms of standards and units of disclosure. So there's comparability. It doesn't help anyone if you have one set of units or one set of standards in one market in one part of the world, and very different set of standards units. And that's what the International Sustainability Standards Board is trying to do. A lot of their work, I think, is leaning quite heavily on frameworks like the TCFD framework, for instance, the work that SASP has done on materiality. So if we can get to a common universal framework, I think that will be great in terms of making things easier for people to assess, analyze, and for the movement of capital, which is defined quite often by people's understanding of the framework. But within those frameworks, my point is merely that those frameworks will throw up a lot of information. The information that you find useful, I think that will depend on which sort of stakeholder constituency you represent, what kind of utility you have in terms of data use and data processing, and don't get unnerved by the fact that there's so much data available. So the economist's point about let's just take one parameter is fine if that's the only use you have for that particular data. But people have many different uses for data. It's not just climate that's the only issue. In India, you have a score of issues, whether it's pollution, whether it's affirmative action, whether it's good governance.
And thank you so much for your time. I want to wrap up with one question. For management graduate students passing out this year, or let's say in the near future, they are probably getting thrown right into the center of the debate of ESG. They've really gotten time to warm up like some of us have over 5-10 years and see the whole thing evolve. What are the few advices that you may have for people pursuing a career now, fresh out of B school?
A lot of people today would say that the whole sustainability thematic, the ESG thematic, is pretty much driving a lot of behavior in exactly the same way that the whole digitization thematic was beginning to drive behavior, say 15 years back. And I would tend to agree with that. I think there is a recognition that the sustainability and ESG challenges are in some ways existential. And if companies don't embrace and understand this, many of them could be out of business. I wrote a book last year called Outlast, and the title was chosen on the basis of the sense that my co-author and I had, that the only way you can sustain your business and outlast your competition is if you take this thematic very seriously. So I think for new graduates, understanding how this is now shaping our world, how this is shaping investor behavior, how this is shaping regulation, the kind of expectations customers increasingly have, will just make it easier for you then to adapt to this brave new world that we're entering. Not to mention the huge number of opportunities that are now popping up in this ecosystem. You're seeing in the audit community, chartered accountants, in businesses, sustainability professionals are really very high in demand. And it's because it's been a field that hasn't been taken that seriously in the past. Now suddenly there's a scarcity of good talent. So I'd encourage all management school graduates these days to seriously consider a long-term career in helping to shape the fortunes of these companies. The last point I'll make is in ESG, one thing which is always sort of defined the discourse, the G of ESG, governance, including the governance of E and the governance of S, is critical. So regardless of which stream or which function you go into, good governance, I think, is never going to go out of fashion. And that's at the core of understanding what the right ESG policy strategy will be. So make sure that you've paid enough attention to that in all your coursework. And as a manager, you really discharge your responsibilities in terms of good governance, whatever else you might do going forward.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. It's been a super useful session. We can talk on this subject for a good another half an hour more, but I'm understanding you're pressed on time. So we will wrap it up here. And depending on the response, I may request another session with you later on. But thank you very much and
Sure.
really useful.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.